Hello and welcome to another edition of Ask the Cricketer as we reflect upon day two of the third test between New Zealand and England from Hamilton. I'm delighted to say that to do so, we've got Cameron Ponsonby coming in live from a sunny Hamilton. Cam, what's your initial thoughts and feelings about what we've seen today?
Uh, it was so weird from England. It was a really, really weird day, and it's kind of also a bad day. Should probably add that bit. And there's an element of comedy to it in that coming up into this Test match, kind of the whole thing that England were being asked like, "Oh, you're going to be ruthless, and you're going to kind of clinch that series whitewash and have that killer edge." And England have been very consistent where they go like, "Don't like the word ruthless. What does it mean?" And I think Ben Stokes has got a fair point when he says that. He goes, "What does being ruthless mean?" Because if someone chips one up in the air and you get the number 11 out, it's like, brilliant. They cleaned up the tail. If that same number 11 blocks for you, it's like, they lack that cutting edge. And there is a point there, but there is an element of comedy of like putting those sentences together and speaking about that in the lead up to a test match and then putting in a performance like today. It was an entirely bizarre day where it started with the strangest hour of play I've seen in a long, long time, followed up by a bad batting display, which was just a capitulation. And then New Zealand kind of cantered along at the end of the day as well. All in all, from a match that was completely in the balance this time yesterday, New Zealand are 340 ahead with 7 wickets in hand, and just, well, barring a miracle, it'll be a New Zealand win.
We'll get on to some of the questions that we've had, which are classically quite sort of existential rather than really linked to this game in
Absolutely, quite
specifically.
right.
But indeed, so but speaking kind of on that subject, but around it, like what's the balance? How do we balance this between thinking, well, this is a dead rubber at the end of a really long test year? England have never played more test matches than they have in 2024. It's a dead rubber. The series is done, and England have got some really important assignments on the horizon that are deserving of their focus, and balance that with the fact that how quite poor they were today and the fact they're going to go down quite easily in, well, certainly 4 days, if not 3 days.
Yeah, it's strange because you saw Ben Stokes at the end of the day when he was bowling, like kind of Williamson drives him down the ground and he's kind of screaming in frustration and the ball gets chipped over cover and he's leaping in hope and kind of falling with his head in his hands. And there's no doubting like this isn't a team that's like phoning it in and being like, oh, I can't be bothered today, lads. But there is frustratingly a correlation where you go, well, this happened against Sri Lanka in the summer where that performance felt, well, people were saying it was arrogant. Michael Vaughan said they were taking the mickey. This one, I don't think there hasn't been any element of that where there's been arrogance on display. But
Mm.
I think it's there does seem to have been a natural kind of just slight foot off the gas of intensity. I think that's a fair enough way to describe it. I think the batting collapse kind of is an illustration of that, where it wasn't mindless, everyone getting out slogging. People just got out in a very varying degrees of different ways. The weird thing is about it is that there will be no time for those kind of, what's the words, for that to come home to roost, for those flaws to come home to roost, if that's the right phrase, because the criticism at the moment is you've had two series, New Zealand and Sri Lanka, where you've put in consecutive poor performances in the quote unquote dead rubber, which shouldn't exist because it's the World Test Championship, but England don't care about the World Test Championship. England's next year's worth of Test cricket, apart from the one-off test against Zimbabwe, is India and Australia. And if the biggest problem in those two series is, guys, you lost the fifth test after winning the series ahead of time, like that's fine. So I don't think we'll ever kind of have an opportunity to see whether this is a trend with this England team. So I think having just written about it and spending a lot of the shows talking about it, I'm wondering whether it's actually a problem or whether it's just something we're going to kind of acknowledge has happened and we'll never find out whether it's a theme. If the biggest problem England have is losing the third test match after they've won the series 2-0, I think that's okay.
Absolutely. So let's talk about some of those wider issues. And William Francis submitted a question saying, "Is what we've seen here one of those occasional collapses? The reason that ultimately England can't win in Australia?" Now, without wishing to rephrase that question from William, but perhaps try and keep the gist of it, was there anything you saw today that we should be worried about when it comes to a series in Australia?
No, I think every touring side is almost contractually obliged to have one kind of brain explosion of a day where it all just
Mm.
goes wrong. And it happens. It happened in India earlier this year, where I think it was in the Rajkot test, third test, or maybe even the Ranchi all the way in the fourth test, where the day from hell arrives, and you go, "Oh, we've got to ride this." So we know there's going to be one of those in Australia. It has to happen. It's impossible that it's not going to happen. There'll be one occasion across 10 innings where England don't muck it up. I think the difference between next year and this year is just there will always be that level of intensity, which England, you hope, would kind of rise to rather than kind of fall as they did today a little bit. You could make an argument that Will O'Rourke bowling 88 miles an hour, tall lads running through England's middle order, you go, that could be an issue because tall, fast bowlers bowling 140 kilometres an hour into your chest. Australia have loads of those. It's one of their favourite things in the world to roll out onto their cricket pitches. But I think as a whole, you're still leaving this series thinking England are in a stronger position for the Ashes than when they arrived, namely because you have Brooke kind of coming into his era. You have Joe Root being as strong as he is. You have Jacob Bethell, if not being the absolute lock at number 3, as I may have said many times because I still want to believe it in my heart, adding batting depth. You have Gus Atkinson and Bryden Cast giving you that pitch-independent style of bowler that will hopefully go very well in Australia. Yes, today's been very poor, but on the whole, if you come away from this New Zealand series and we're going to reflect on it in its entirety, I think England will be pretty pleased.
Yeah, to give our readers, listeners, and viewers a sort of peek behind the curtain while play's going on, me and Cameron are sort of talking about what our respective bits of copy are going to look like during the day, and I inevitably, in the first session, have to field something around whether Jacob Bethell is going to slip into his, and I think it nearly did it until he got out, until he sort of sparks that collapse in the afternoon.
So I'm going to need you to say that question again. The team were just walking past, and someone, I don't know who, just on the biggest burp in history, and everyone started laughing. And I have no idea what's happening. So I heard Jacob Bethell. We can clip that up. It was a good moment. Jacob Bethell. I'm going to need all of that again.
Excellent. Well, okay. Well, let's move on. It wasn't a to and fro. We can move on. Let's move on to another question then, as you demanded. So, from Reese Benjamin, and he is asking, how much rope does Crawley have left? Matt Henry will want to pick him up and take him all around the world with him.
Well, big moment for Zach today. Got off the mark against Henry. For his 5th innings, it's had such a torrid time. It's so weird. So Crawley's batted against New Zealand more than anyone else in his career, and his record is so anomalous. He's averaging I think it's still below 11. It's remarkable. But obviously, if the scores continue in the vein they have been for this series in Pakistan, that's not feasible. That's not a tenable situation to have your opening batter in. But the whole kind of Zach Crawley storyline and selection from day dot has been building towards the Ashes. That's where that's almost the point of him, where you go, blimey, this tall lad gets on top of the bounce, smokes it through the covers, can pull off a length. He's brilliant. It's why when he scored that 70 in Sydney last time round, Ricky Ponting was like, this guy can play. This is the one. This is the real talent that England have. So England will be desperate for Crawley to make it work, to get some runs in India. He only needs to get some. He doesn't need to get loads. He just needs to get some to get on the plane in Australia. So yes, there could be pressure on selection places with Jacob Bethell. Realistically, there's so much time for someone to trip and fall, so it will all work itself out. But it's going to be 3 into 2 of Crawley, Pope, and Bethell. And at the moment of those 3, I think Crawley is the most settled. And I'd be stunned. I think he literally needs to average in the teens or 22 between now and India to not be on the plane and not be starting in Australia. So a lot of rope is the answer to that question.
Yeah, I think it's one of those that if it's a confidence thing, then I think a few innings on a road in Canterbury would be pretty useful in May or in April. But if it's slightly wider than that, then I guess that's the issue. But what are the options that England have got? I mean, they don't. There's lots of competition around that 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, etc. There's not a massive amount. It doesn't feel like there's a massive amount of competition around 1 and 2.
No, you're right, and that showed itself in this series, like England don't have a reserve opener out here with them. I don't think they took one to Pakistan either, when they could have had the option of like ringing the Keaton, Jennings, play spin well, Claxon.
Mm.
That would kind of be the final depth piece in the puzzle probably for this England team, because even if you could look at the spin department, you could make the argument the best spinner in England currently is the second choice spinner, where you go like Leach is basically a known quantity, and they go, we know what you are, this is fine, we'll take you around when we need to, and we'll play you if we need to, but we're going to let Bashir have the chance to develop into the bowler we think he can be for when Australia rolls around. But there isn't that batter at 1 on 2, which is putting pressure on Crawley and Duckett. And until of late, like, they had no reason to feel under pressure, as it were. There was no one. They were doing well, so even if someone else was doing well in the county championship, they wouldn't have been challenging them. Now, if we have this kind of period of time where you're not seeing the kind of output from Crawley that you'd want and you'd desire, does that mean that an opener from the domestic circuit is going to potentially push for that place? Or is Jacob Bethel, with the technique he's shown and his aptitude at batting potentially 3, could he flip up one more place in the order? I want to just say I think I hate that idea, but it's something that's entirely possible and will be discussed at length over the coming months and years of your life.
Hopefully not beyond that. In terms of, I mean, you've written in your piece, and I've written kind of in mine today, that the outcome of this game is sort of beyond doubt. However, like, can you try and map out a path for us from an England perspective in terms of what a route to saving this game or winning it looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually kind of only thought of this after hitting send on the piece and going, I kind of wish I'd included that. I think there's a world where England kind of take these last 7 wickets for about 120 runs, and the target to chase is 460, and there's just a little sweet spot where it kind of clicks this England team's like mind back into gear, and they go, how cool it would be to chase 460. We could do that. That's a funny, exciting, cool thing to do. That would be on brand with who we are. If it gets up to 500, or if it was weirdly below 400, I think there wouldn't necessarily be that intensity, because they're still being in the kind of a quote-unquote normal test match, although they've collapsed. If they're presented with a sizable, historic, but not impossible task, I think you're then getting into really interesting areas where someone like Stokes is going like, I would love to be able to say, do you remember when we chased 460 at Seddon Park? And Anton Devcic, the former Black Cap, is on commentary here for TalkSport, and I was just talking to one of the TalkSport commentators, and Devcic was saying, like, this is a chasing ground. That's what it's known for, kind of locally, that the pitch gets better, it gets flatter, it's a small boundary. If you're defending a total and a team gets after you, you get nervous very, very quickly, and that kind of sounds like a perfect storm for England, really, in terms of if there is that kind of sizable task, they'll go out, they'll belt it, and they'll try and make history.
And just finally, before we let you go, in terms of New Zealand, apart from personnel, which obviously we're well aware of the changes that they've made, and they brought in a few of the guys that kind of led them to that series win in India, being in amongst both groups as you have been, what's your sense of, has anything shifted from their perspective, or are they just taking advantage of England being a little bit a bit tired, their intensity being down, as we mentioned, and just a few other things going their way? What's your sense of where New Zealand are at?
I think it's horrible to be this kind of individualistic and simplistic about it, but Young's come in and scored runs at the top of the order, and that just makes such a big difference, because it means everyone else is then coming in at an easier time to bat, basically, and that is an exponential impact. And that's not to say, like, Devon Conway, for all the kind of shock and horror, but oh god, he's not scored any runs. Part of the reason he was still batting in this series ahead of Will Young, despite Will Young getting player of the series in India, is he got 90 in India, like 3-4 test matches ago. Had he scored a half century in one of the first 2 tests, you'd be like, oh, he's actually kind of not in awful form at the moment, he's deserving of his place. Then aside from that, not really. I think they maybe stumbled across a happy accident by only having 3 seamers here, in that they bowled O'Rourke for longer and potentially brought him on earlier than they had done when they had 4, and they could kind of let 2 guys really get into their spells for a bit longer. And so rather than a quarter of your overs being from O'Rourke, a third of them were from O'Rourke, and that helped, and he bowled very, very well. I don't think New Zealand are very far away from being, or just returning to being, a very good team. Yes, there's question marks over the batting lineup and its brittle nature, which is the word I've used about 1,000 times over the last 2 weeks. But I think their bowling attack, like, it feels cruel to say it, but like Tim Southee is the obvious weak link at the moment. Incredible player, amazing career, but of that seam attack, if you'd put Nathan Smith in today, you go like, that's hot. That is very hot. That is something, rude word, hot, and it works. You've got 3 seamers there, and potentially a 4th with Ben Sears when he comes back, or you go the spin option with Santner. It's a very good, very exciting bowling lineup. So I don't think New Zealand were ever that far away in this series. I think they're a good team playing badly, and today and yesterday they've been a good team playing well.